Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Australia Institute's Climate Academy. Today, we're talking about Donald Trump. Let's face it, at some point we had to. If he's true to his word, and he's already started, the president may be the worst thing to happen to the climate movement since it became a movement. I'm Glenn Connley, Senior Media Advisor here at the Australia Institute, coming to you live from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. My guests today are Leanne Minshull, Strategic Director at the Australia Institute, and Dr. Emma Shortis, Director of the International and Security Affairs Program here at the Institute. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Glenn. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Leanne, a quick word to get us started. We have a climate denier in the White House. He has about 1,370 days left in office, give or take. How much damage has he done, and how much can he do in the next 1,370 days?
Oh, and will it only be 1,370 days or will it be more? I'll wait for Emma to talk about that. We're so lucky to have Emma with us this morning, who knows so much about US politics and the man in the White House. I think we need to, when we look at what Donald Trump is doing to the climate movement, or action on climate change, I'd like to split it into two different parts, because there is the impact that he'll have on multilateral climate negotiations. So the Conference of Parties, the COPs, most people will know that Australia's put in quite a strong bid to hold the COP in Australia next year. In itself, that's quite ironic, because I think we're either the second or third largest fossil fuel exporter in the world. So it's again going to come to a petro state. That's a whole other session in a whole other webinar. But what is the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and the COP process by America mean for climate action? I actually think it could be an opportunity, because the US have been blockers in all of the negotiations to date, and I'm including every single administration in that. So they've done three things, really. They've tried to undermine the negotiation and the text in general. They've failed to meet any of their commitments on financing. They block any talk of climate justice and equitable transfer of knowledge, and also putting proper compensation into loss and damage funds. And then they've expanded fossil fuels. And I guess that's the second point. Second thing that I'd split it into. So if we look over here, what are they going to do to multilateral negotiations? Well, in fact, not having the US there might be a benefit. And let's see, the US has been in a group called the Umbrella Group. Like, COP processes, everyone's got acronyms. And then if you get like all the countries in the world together to sit in a meeting, which is an acronym of itself, there's just like, so let's not go into all the things, but there is an umbrella group who tend to try to negotiate together. There's about 11 or 12 countries. It has got the US, the UK, Japan, Norway, Kazakhstan, Iceland, Canada. I would have missed a few, Australia, but my point here is, I guess, countries like New Zealand and Norway have traditionally tried to advocate within that umbrella group to make the multilateral agreement stronger. And they've always been undermined by the US, ably supported by the US as Deputy Sheriff Australia. So without that negative impact there, can we get somewhere in the multilateral negotiations that we couldn't have got to before? And then there's the internal impact, or the direct impact that the US will have on climate change, or on stopping action on climate change. And Emma's going to know a lot more about this than me, but my top line things is that the president said he'll end the war on coal, which is interesting, but like, he can't actually legislate what type of energy consumers or corporations can purchase. And there's so much competition now in price from gas, which is not good because it's a fossil fuel as well, but also renewables. I don't know how ending the war on coal is going to go in reality. I think taking money out of renewable research is bad. They were spending like $550 billion on research. So I think that's not good. There's also getting rid of a lot of the regulations. That's a really bad news story for nature in the US. And we've always got to remember that climate change and nature restoration are two sides of the same coin. And we've got to have both, right? So, but, if I try to be Pollyanna and think of one thing that would be optimistic about that. Yes, it'll make it easier for coal, gas, and oil, but it'll also make it easier for solar. So one of the land management, um, not organized departments in the US suggested that they need about 22 million acres of land freed up for solar. So who knows, maybe that would be better. But overall, that's like grasping at straws, really, I guess, even as I'm
Yeah.
saying, I'm like, oh, come on, Leanne. But yeah, so I think they're the two ways. I think the domestic influence and probably the cultural and political influence that I'm sure Emma will talk about, to me, is much more dangerous than pulling out of the COP process. I think that's actually an opportunity. And everyone, like, can you imagine there are going to be countries like Canada who want to have a whack at the US anywhere they can, and actually not having the US in the COP process is just another opportunity for people to go, look, those idiots left, and look how good we can do without them.
Thanks, Leanne. Emma, let's come to you for an opening comments. You were in Washington for the election, and like so many of his policies, his climate policy was little more than a few slogans, about how he's going to wipe out existing policy, and of course that awful phrase, drill, baby, drill. But of all the things that turned your stomach on election night, where did his position on climate change sit with you?
There are a lot of things to turn your stomach, aren't there, Glenn? Look, I think, Trump's climate policies have always been really clear. He's always been really consistent. And we knew that if he won again, he would do things like, as Leanne said, withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement really quickly. So that was actually really straightforward. And I mean, of course, turns the stomach because we know how dangerous it is. Leanne started outlining that. But I think the thing that actually turned my stomach the most about climate stuff in the US when I was there for the election was how much, it highlighted the failures of the Biden administration and the Democrats and how they paved the way for Trump. People forget, I think, that Biden came to power. He won the nomination in 2020 and won the election off the back of climate activists and progressive activists calling for things like a Green New Deal. And the first 2 years of his administration were actually pretty good on climate, by the standards of US action on climate. The Biden administration oversaw the passing of the most significant climate legislation in American history, in the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a lot of really progressive climate policies and industrial policies kind of wrapped up in it. And that was really driving the success and the long-term success, I think, of the Biden administration, and also starting to revitalize US democracy. In the second half of his administration, he lost that completely. He stopped talking to progressives. He lost that connection to what had brought him to power, to those progressive forces that had brought him to power. And that's partly what paved the way, I think, for Trump to win again. And some of the significant failures there were that, he did pass that legislation, as I mentioned, but so much of his climate policy was done by executive order. He rejoined the Paris Agreement, or he got the United States back in the Paris Agreement by executive order, which means Trump could just get them straight back out again by executive order. As he was leaving office, Biden attempted to protect much of the Arctic, much of Alaska, and US offshore, the kind of offshore around the US from drilling and opening up more gas and oil fields by executive order. So Trump could undo it. And that was, I guess, one of the things that Trump learned, or the people around Trump learned from his first administration, was that it's actually really easy to do that, to undo things around climate legislation. And that was where Trump was really successful in his first administration, around kind of withdrawing from Paris, undoing climate action. And that practice, those learnings are now being applied everywhere. So the kinds of stuff that Trump is doing in, unwinding diversity, equity, inclusion measures is stuff he practiced with climate issues last time around. And so all of that learning is being applied. And I guess that's the kind of scary thing, is that a lot of his climate stuff is a test run for other issues. And you can see that examples of oppression of climate protests, for example. That is something that, again, the Biden administration and other administrations facilitated in things like going after protesters around the Dakota Access Pipeline. So there are all these precedents really for Trump that were created by Democratic administrations that he was then able to capitalize on. So I think that's a really long way of saying that climate really highlights, I think, the failures of not just the Democrats, but the US political system more broadly. And we're seeing those failures play out in the climate space, but also in connected spaces, which maybe we can get into a little bit more. But I guess the other thing I'd really emphasize is, to agree with Leanne so much about how, Trump is a wrecker. He's absolutely a wrecker when it comes to climate policy, but the United States has always been that. It's never really been a leader in climate action. What Trump does, as he does with so many things, is reveal that truth and make it undeniable.
Thanks, Emma. Let's just get to a bit of housekeeping before we continue this conversation. You can type questions for Emma and Leanne using the Q&A section of the box here. We can upvote other people's questions as well. Post your questions at any time. Don't wait till the end. Please keep things nice. I know this is emotional content for some, but we're all grown-ups. And finally, this is a live event. It is being recorded. The video will be available on the Australia Institute's website today. Since becoming US President, Donald Trump has abandoned both the Paris Agreement and, as we've already discussed, the COP process. He's committed to tearing up the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes some of the most progressive climate policies, at least in terms of scale, in the world. He scrapped the moratorium on new coal mines, slashed funding to climate change research, UN climate change programs, and renewable projects. More recently, he's even reconsidering the official finding that greenhouse gases are harmful to public health. Let's go back to our panel. Let's start on the Paris Agreement. I know you've already touched on that, Leanne. You would presume, or at least hope, the next president would bring the US back into the fold in 4 years. But in terms of the COP and Paris processes, what does 4 years of going backwards mean?
Well, it's an interesting question because it's actually quite subjective. Because for a start, I'd challenge the premise that having the US out of it is going to force the process backwards. As like in my opening comments, I think there's an opportunity actually to push it forward. Then there's a lot of people think that the COP process, it doesn't work at all anyway. As Greta Thunberg says, it's blah, 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 blah. Then other people, I know that a lot of people that I talk to in Pacific nations like the process because it's one of the only multilateral negotiating platforms where they actually have an equal say with the rest of the world. A lot of, obviously, trade and security is, and again, I'm always nervous talking about this sort of stuff with Emma, but I think it's fair to say that when we're looking at trade or security negotiations, the more money, the more hardware you've got, the more heft you've got at the table. But at the climate change negotiating table, everybody has an equal say. I know that a lot of people say that the Pacific Islands have got the moral authority. I also know that a lot of Pacific Islanders, well, one man said to me in Fiji not long ago, if anyone else says to me that to me again, I'm just going to punch them. I don't want moral authority. I just want climate action. And it's unfair for the world to look at us to lead climate action when we're so under-resourced and at such threat compared to countries like Australia, which is just next door. What does worry me, and I think Australia has copied from the US, is we've got some of the most oppressive anti-protest laws in the world. And in South Australia in particular, they're particularly bad. And that's where we're going to want to host COP if we have it. So I think that we're learning some bad lessons from the US is more worrying to me than what will happen without the US presence at COP. If I'm putting okay, so let's say we're having a COP process, we're holding it in Australia, we want to make the most of it that we possibly can. The opportunities for people is to not just sit back and say, oh, well, the US have pulled out of it, what's the point? We all may as well give up. No, that's not good enough. The other thing is to push our country to be leaders. So if we're going to hold the COP, we should at least have a commitment from the government. They should have at least named the date when they will approve the last gas or coal mine. I don't think that's too much to ask. So as a moment in time, I think there's opportunities for us to push for things without being encumbered by a great big voice that is the US at the table telling us that it's unrealistic, because what's actually unrealistic is to keep opening up new fossil fuels and think that we're all going to survive. We're just not. That's not subjective, that's science. So I'm actually quite excited by the fact that the US have pulled themselves out of the negotiation process around COPs. And I think, I kind of think in a way the COPs needed a bit of a shake-up anyway. So having one big act to pull out, let's see if that can be the circuit breaker that we need to get actual commitments and commitments to stop things. So not just commitments to put more solar on. Yes, we've got to do that, but we need commitments coming out of COP around how we're going to stop and then wind back the fossil fuel industry, and also what we're going to do about loss and damage. Because one thing I've noticed coming out of the Trump administration as well, it's not just saying that they don't believe that, may not believe that greenhouse gas emissions harm people, but they're completely rejecting the notion that there's any sort of liability, historic liability for emissions, which is outrageous, just outrageous.
Emma, let's talk about the American people on the subject of tariffs and America becoming a trade pariah. We're being told the big losers will be the American people. But what about if America becomes a climate pariah? What does that do? Do the American people still care about climate?
Look, I think it's a really interesting question, Glenn, because I think there's an argument that, they don't. You can make a very easy argument that they don't, in that it didn't feature really in the election campaign, except for the slogans "drill baby drill" or Kamala Harris talking up, how much gas production the Biden administration had opened up and increased. And so you can make that really straightforward argument that it's not an issue at the forefront of American minds. But I don't think that's right. I think that Americans do care about climate change across a number of fronts. The Yale Climate Communication Program, for example, has noted that, a vast majority of Americans are worried about the impact of global warming. And that's for very real, very material reasons, like places like Louisiana, for example, around the Mississippi River Delta are experiencing extraordinary land loss, and 1.2 million people live in that region. And it is already underwater, literally the water is lapping at people's houses. And so people care about it in a material way. And we've done a lot of research here at the Australia Institute about the impact of climate change on the cost of insurance, for example, and homes becoming uninsurable because of climate change. That problem is so much bigger in the United States. Huge swathes of the United States are becoming completely uninsurable in places like California, in places like Louisiana. And so it is a very real problem. During the election campaign, there were unprecedented hurricanes in the Carolinas, for example. And so it is an active issue. It's not necessarily spoken about in those direct terms, but it's something that people are experiencing constantly.
So do they talk about, though, like we always hear from our politicians about the regularity and severity of weather events. Is that how Americans look at those sorts of events you've talked about?
It's certainly not the way that one side of politics looks at them.
Yeah.
Trump and Republicans, much as they do here, will say, we've always experienced bad weather. We're a resilient people, blah, 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 as Leanne said. But certainly during the hurricanes in the Carolinas, for example, that I mentioned, Biden and Democrats and progressives across the political spectrum as well, I should say, we're talking about, how these events are fueled by climate change. The same thing happened during the fires in California, literally, as Trump was being inaugurated, California was on fire. And there was a lot of talk, of course, about how climate change is exacerbating those fires. It was winter. It was the middle of winter, and California was experiencing some of the worst fires it's ever seen. So climate change is an enormous issue for Americans. Again, they're not necessarily just describing it directly, but it's a security issue. And I think framing it that way is really important, because it is directly threatening the lives of Americans. And so they do care about it, I think. And again, I think that's where we can look at the failures perhaps of the Biden administration to communicate that and to, I guess, recognize the threat that people are facing every day. So much of that campaign was about how things were okay and Biden had done really great stuff and Kamala Harris was going to keep doing pretty much exactly what the Biden administration was doing. And clearly there was no appetite for that. You know, there's a recognition in the electorate that that is not enough. And so I think those political lessons are really important for us to understand. I think that question about the United States being a climate pariah, though, is a really interesting one, because Americans are, you know, famously kind of insular and are not particularly worried about how the United States is perceived in the world. And you can see, again, you know, Trump is making that truth undeniable in the way that his administration is behaving in the world. But as Leanne said, I think there's a huge opportunity there domestically in the United States for opposition to Trump, but also internationally. You know, there was so much talk during the first Trump administration about, you know, places standing up and becoming the new leader in climate action, like the European Union. There was huge pressure on the European Union to do more when it comes to climate action, and that didn't really materialize. But I think the pressure is much greater this time around. And because it isn't just in the climate space, it is in the security space, the economic space as well. I think there is the opportunity is greater. You know, Leanne mentioned Canada. You have to look at Canada and how politically popular standing up to the Trump administration actually is. That's been transformative for the Liberal Party in Canada. To see that writ large globally, I think, again, is a huge opportunity. But countries like Australia have to make the choice to take that opportunity. And it does require bravery. You know, standing up to the world's most powerful country, the world's most powerful economy, requires some bravery. But doing that collectively, you know, I think shares the risk. So I think there is a huge opportunity there. And there's a real opportunity, as Leanne said, for Australia to step up, particularly in our region.
Well, you've touched on Canada just there. Our first question is about Canada from Richard, who asks, what can we expect from the Canadian election as an indicator for Australia?
It's a really good question. And I don't know about you, but I get nervous about predicting this kind of stuff. But the turnaround in Canada has been extraordinary. You know, Trudeau resigned, and because the prospects for his Liberal Party were so bad, you know, they were looking at a catastrophic defeat. He'd resigned. He was kind of scrambling to get Trump to give Canada some carve-outs for those tariffs that Trump was going to impose. He did all the usual things. You know, he went to Mar-a-Lago. He had dinner with Trump. He really kind of did the groveling that Trump loves, and of course, it didn't work. You know, Trump was still talking about Canada as the 51st state. He's even kind of threatening annexation. And then we have this huge shift in Canada where all of a sudden the opposition gets much stronger, and you have an almost grassroots movement to boycott American products in Canada. You had Canadians booing the American national anthem at ice hockey games, and then the Liberals and even the Conservative opposition being really strong in their opposition to what Trump was doing. And almost overnight, you see an extraordinary turnaround in polling where the Liberal Party, it's a small L Liberal Party, Trudeau's party, went from looking at catastrophic defeat to actually leading in the polls and looking like they might hold on. And so I think, of course, you know, as the Australian Labor Party has got an eye on what's happening in Canada and what that election result might be. But I think across the United States traditional allies, it's becoming clear that there isn't an appetite for what Trump is doing, at least not a big one, and that actually standing up to him in a values-based way is pretty popular.
And we're feeling that here, Leanne, aren't we?
Oh yeah, I think that I actually don't know when the Canadian election is on. Do either of you know?
It's soon.
I can check. I think it's
That's
soon.
all right. Yeah. I'm just curious. So yeah, that absolutely happened. And I think in Australia you can see if Peter Dutton was ever going to hitch his wagon to a MAGA style campaign. Some people say he was going to, others say he wasn't. What everybody agrees to now is that he ain't doing it anymore because it's not popular. So Jacinta Price, as the senator for the Liberal Party, actually had a bit of a tin ear on this because she was out in a MAGA hat and was using a lot of the words around it that kind of. But I think both the leaders here are trying to distance themselves as much as possible from Trump. And I don't think there's the same cultural and geographic closeness and geographic proximity that Canada's got. And the reaction to America there is a lot more visceral than what it is here, because they haven't said that Australia is going to be their 52nd or 53rd state or whatever. So we don't have that same sort of pushback. But just picking up on something else that Emma said about, the country needs to be brave to stand up to an economy that's so big. And it made me think of, we often talk as our leaders as hard men, and I'm just using that, I'm being gender specific because both of our leaders are men, but we say that, we want, like, they're always talking about being a hard leader, but it's interesting when they do that, they talk about, I'm going to be hard on crime, or I'm going to be hard on immigration. Like, they're always going to be hard on people or subjects that have less power than what they do. If you're going to be a hard man on someone with more power, then you actually do transition from hard to brave. And I think that people are crying out for bravery in our political leaders. Like, not all of us have massive personal courage, and that's okay. But our leaders absolutely 100% need to have public, personal, and political bravery, because that's what we deserve.
I'll keep going on the questions. One from Ronald. Harvard University is being defunded by Trump. Will joint research centres in Australia be adversely affected? And if so, how can we minimise this? Maybe start with you, Leanne.
Well, I think this is one for Emma. She's the academic in the panel.
recovering.
Oh, sorry.
Look, Australian universities have already been affected by Trump's attack on higher education. Australian universities like ANU that receive funding from the United States through various grants, like health grants, for example, have been sent things like questionnaires about anti-American sentiment in their research teams, about the kind of climate justice research that they do, and have actually had some funding withdrawn. So this is a really important example, I think, of how you can't separate what Trump is doing domestically from what he is doing internationally. There aren't clean dividing lines between those things. Trump's attacks on independent research are quite extraordinary, and Harvard, I think, is a particularly important example, because what Trump did there was, what the Trump administration did there was say that the federal grants that Harvard receive were going to be reviewed and, probably withdrawn. But I think everybody, including me, expected Harvard to cave, to give Trump what he wanted because of the money. Ivy League colleges like this are like dragons, kind of hoarding their gold. They have billions of dollars in their endowments, like much bigger than most countries' wealth. But that didn't actually happen because of huge grassroots pressure from the student body and the alumni community. Harvard has actually really pushed back and said that it's not going to capitulate to Trump. And that has sent a huge signal to the rest of the sector about standing up to him. So I think that, again, that's a really big opportunity. And it's an opportunity, I think, as well, for Australia to kind of begin to reframe our relationship with the United States, because Australian universities have really important relationships, research relationships, exchange relationships with American universities, and they do really important research on climate impact, for example. And so the Australian government actually supporting the Australian higher education sector and tertiary sector to do that research and to do it in collaboration is another really big opportunity, I think, for Australia to stand up in that space that the Trump administration is vacating. But I guess the other thing I would want to say on that, just to kind of keep on my brand of being grim about things, is just how dangerous the attacks on science and climate research in particular are, not just domestically in the United States, but for the rest of the world. And it's often in really kind of mundane ways. It's where the Trump administration is withdrawing funding from, like, national weather services that use satellite data to monitor climate impacts and to do things like model hurricanes, for example, which don't respect national borders. Rescinding research funding and funding for that kind of work has huge international repercussions. If we're not working with the United States to collect that data, to analyze it, and to understand the threats that climate-induced hurricanes or droughts pose, not just to the United States, but to the rest of the world, that leaves us exposed. And so I think, there are a million little ways where what the Trump administration is doing add up to significant security threats to the rest of the world, and we shouldn't ever minimize that.
Emma, is that just before we came on? Sorry, Glenn, jumping in, but just before we came on, you were talking about eco-fascism. Is that what you were referring to with the? I'm just interested in that.
Yeah, sure. I think this is one of the things that gets kind of lost in the flood of news around what the Trump administration is doing, and it absolutely is connected. I mentioned the hurricanes in the Carolinas, for example, during the election campaign, and if you don't have the science or the data collection to predict what those hurricanes are doing, you obviously put more people in danger, and Trump is doing that in a number of ways. So he's also done things, or the administration is also doing things like undermining, gutting the Federal Emergency Management Authority, FEMA, that's like the kind of first responders to climate disaster. And in the United States, what that is doing, what the kind of removal of that kind of funding is doing, which actually, takes people off the ground who are helping to rescue people or helping to get people back on their feet after a disaster, is it opens the space for what are effectively white supremacist militias militia groups in the United States that after January 6 did a huge rebranding effort. So they stopped talking about white supremacy directly and started working in communities on particular communities affected by disaster, where they would go in first. They get there before FEMA agents. They get there before the federal government response and start helping people to rebuild, or helping people to sandbag, or helping people to clear out trash, or whatever. So they kind of ingratiate themselves in communities and use that as a gateway for both recruitment, but also to spread white supremacist ideology. And they do this quite explicitly. Like, you can read lots of research about how they talk about this amongst themselves as a rebranding and recruitment strategy. And so what Trump's gutting of the federal government, of federal agencies in the climate space, is deeply connected to the support he has from those white supremacist militias and white supremacist organizations that, basically led January 6. And so this is I guess, a really long way of saying that this is deeply connected. Trump's particular brand of American fascism uses climate change, and it uses the undermining of the institutions of the state to, I guess, create a kind of cycle where white supremacy is further entrenched into American political culture. And that is really
this
concerning.
new, Emma? Have they always used this kind of a tactic, or because of this vacuum that's opening up, they're jumping in now?
It's relatively new, Glenn. Like, it's the white supremacists have always been active in this kind of space, particularly in places like Oregon, which experiences wildfires. You will see white supremacist militias attempting to do kind of civilian policing during evacuations, for example. So they've done a little bit of it before, but Trump is absolutely opening the space for them and doing it quite deliberately. And they're very good at capitalizing on that space and creating that feedback loop. And so there's that kind of grassroots aspect, but there's also a kind of top-down eco-fascism happening that's embodied by people like Elon Musk, right, who is absolutely engaging in kind of white supremacist rhetoric around his stuff about population and birth rates. And so you have those kinds of things meeting together, I suppose, and reinforcing white supremacy and the connection between climate disaster and opening that space, I suppose, for the further entrenchment of that. And also, the way that those white supremacist militias will go in and assist white communities and leave black and brown communities to experience the full front of climate disaster. So you end up entrenching this kind of inequality. It's pretty grim, I think, but there are some really important lessons there about what the erosion of the federal government, of institutions of the state, can do to a political culture.
Duly. I might keep moving on with questions, as grim as that was.
Yeah,
Thanks, Emma. A question from Cherie. Are we paying enough attention to the Atlas network organisations like the Heritage Foundation in the US, the IPA, CIS, and Advance here in Australia? Would Trump be president without these powerful players and the fossil fuel money behind them?
I'm going to have first crack at this to give Emma a minute to have a sip of water, but leave the actual impact on Atlas and their help in electing Trump to Emma. But I'll say for Australia, I think that I think we are actually in a little bit of a different situation in Australia because of our democratic institutions. So thank goodness that we've got compulsory voting, number one. So we don't have to spend a lot of our political capital or our time talking about policy just on getting people out to vote. People are going to go and vote. Increasingly, we're voting early, but it is a part of the way that we, and there's a very small percentage of people who really don't like the compulsory voting system. I mean, some people can whinge about it, but by and large, we're pretty happy with it. We also have a preferential voting system, so we don't have the situation where somebody who got less than a third or even less, I don't know, Emma can say in a minute what the actual percentage of votes were that went to Trump as a proportion of the overall adult population. That would never happen in Australia because of our voting systems. I think that the sort of the breaking up of the Murdoch press, and breaking up by that I mean not literally breaking it up, but competing with it through social media and other ways of communicating with each other. It's kind of pulled down a little bit the power of the Daily Telegraph used to be able to decide elections just about. I remember that when I was in my when I first started voting, that was a real thing. Like, everybody had to get the editors of the Daily Mirror back in those days and the Daily Sun on side. I don't think that's the case anymore. They've still got enormous power, but it's not the type of power that they used to have. And I think as a consequence of all of those institutions and also a cultural connection to the way that operates, it just means that people like Atlas and the Heritage Foundation don't get the same footholds. You can't say that the IPA is anywhere as near as powerful as some of the right-wing think tanks in the US. And I think there's a reason why the Australia Institute's actually the most influential think tank in Australia. It's because we do solid research that's based on ideas, not an adherence to an ideology or a particular political party. So I think that we start from a landscape that's really different. Having said that, I think it's precious and we have to protect it. And we have to, I think the reaction to Dutton's kind of, as I said before, he's moving away from being seen as anything to do with Trump. It's really unpopular when they start talking about cutting services. Australians love our Medicare. The Americans have got no idea what a universal health system looks like. None. And one of the most shared piece of research as we did was only a couple of weeks ago when we looked at the price that Americans have to pay for medicine compared to the price that Australians have to pay. And please go back and look at the data rather than take my word for it. But Australians over 50, and there's a lot of people taking statin every day. It's an anti-cholesterol drug. It costs Australians something like $2.80 per week if you're prescribed statin, and it reduces your risk of heart attack like substantially. And in the US, it was over $1,000. Who can, and maybe that was, like, as I said, go and have a look at it. Don't quote me on that because the numbers will be wrong. But it was, I had to look 3 times because I just couldn't believe. So I think, anyway, what Emma is, maybe you can take it from there on the power of these institutions in the US.
Yeah, sure. I just popped a link to that research on the PBS, the comparison into the chat, because it is extraordinary to look at. It is absolutely wild and really highlights how broken the United States health system is and how much that drives political disaffection and actually explains the rise of Trump. And there are political lessons there, I think, for not just Australia, but for democracies across the world. I cannot emphasize enough how much Leanne is right about Australia's political institutions and how precious they are. The United States, if the United States had compulsory voting, it would be unrecognisable from what it is today. You know, you would have, I mean, presumably you would have a democratic system that is actually responsive and does things like act on gun control or act on reproductive rights or act on a health system, which are overwhelmingly things that Americans want. And part of the reason that organizations like Atlas or the Heritage Foundation have so much influence is because American democracy is so deeply flawed, you know, that it is unresponsive and it allows powerful actors to have such extraordinary influence. And again, Trump didn't create that situation. He's just very good at highlighting the reality and taking political advantage of that reality. So, you know, you might remember there was a moment in the election campaign where Trump literally said to the fossil fuel industry, if you give me $2 billion for my election campaign, I'll do exactly what you want. I'll do whatever you want. Right. And he is, you know, he's opening up more of the United States to oil drilling. He's opening it up for prospecting and permitting. He's undoing regulations that fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel adjacent industries don't like, you know, emission standards in vehicles, for example, attacking the electric vehicle industry. You know, he is acting in the interests of fossil fuels. But again, he can do that because the system allows him to. And, you know, those are things that Democrats in particular have had the opportunity to fix and have chosen not to, because many of them also benefit from a system that allows that kind of influence. And I think, you know, it's really important to highlight places like the Heritage Foundation, which wrote Project 2025, which is now being used effectively as a playbook by the Trump administration for its policies in climate in particular. You know, the Heritage Foundation Project 2025 called for, you know, basically the kind of, you know, keyword search climate in any kind of federal funding organizations to be withdrawn. And that is what is happening. So you can trace the influence really, really clearly. Again, I think we have a very different system where that kind of egregious influence doesn't necessarily happen, but it is a precious thing that we need to guard. And there have been efforts to undermine it, you know, particularly around political donations that the Australia Institute Democracy and Accountability Program has done really important research on. And so I think being really vigilant around that is really critical for Australia. But I think, you know, again, to go back to what Leanne was saying, Trump highlights the risk in a way that no one else does. And I think Australians, the Australian community, are responding. You know, that Leanne mentioned that Dutton's kind of very short-lived policy around gutting the public service. He walked it back because it was so deeply unpopular.
He's also, we've got a question about Dutton, and I might start with you, Leanne. He's also, there were some echoes of not so much the attacks on EVs that we heard from Trump, but certainly support for big gas guzzlers. But he's tiptoed around the climate. We saw his stumble in the ABC debate on whether or not he believes in climate change. The question from Dorothy, what happens if the coalition wins the election? Will Dutton cancel our application to have COP here?
I think undoubtedly he will. I mean, I don't know. Who knows? Like, look how fast he walked back from his unpopular stance. I think the thing that we could count on is that Dutton will do. Actually, you know what? I was thinking, my thought was in my head and about to come out my mouth, and my other voice was arguing with me because Dutton's done something pretty crazy lately. So let me have a very schizophrenic conversation just for 2 minutes. So traditional wisdom, I would have thought 4 or 5 weeks ago that if Dutton wins, if the coalition win the election, then they will the only thing that they will do around COP is whatever the fossil fuel industry wants them to do. So let's not forget that fossil fuel industries, it's a big trade show for the fossil fuel industries, the COPs. Who knows if Santos and Inpex and others ring him up and say we'd rather it be in Australia than Turkey, I'm sure that he would do the bidding of the fossil fuel comrades, which is probably the most inappropriate term for that. But anyway, but look what Peter Dutton's come out and done in the past 5 weeks, and that's actually shifted the entire national narrative around whether we have a gas shortage or not. And this was the other voice in my head. So he's done something that the gas companies really don't like. They really don't want Dutton highlighting the fact that there is no gas shortage in Australia, because it's really hard for our government to argue that we need more gas wells opened up if we don't have a shortage. When the only people that are going to benefit from this are foreign-owned companies that pay hardly anything in royalties or tax. We're exporting more gas to, Japan exports more gas than they buy from us. One Japanese company, Impex, we've got a report out about that today. They export more gas, more LNG from Darwin than New South Wales, South Australia, and the eastern bordered states basically use combined in a year. Like, it's just mind blowing, the stuff that's happening on gas. But it hasn't been the ALP that have gone up against the gas industry and said that we need a gas reservation policy. And basically, we don't have a shortage, we've got an export problem. It's been the coalition. So I think I'm going to take back my original thought, which was that Dutton will do whatever is best for his fossil fuel comrades. Dutton will do whatever's best for Dutton. And I think that we can absolutely, I think that's a statement I'm happy with. And if Dutton decides that going ahead with the COP would be good for him, then we'd go ahead with the COP. If he decides it bad, then we wouldn't. And within that, there would be input from the fossil fuel industry. I don't think that's I think that the only negotiating that Dutton will be doing after the election is for him to remain leader of the opposition. I don't, unless there's something dramatic that happens in the next 8 or 9 days. And bear in mind, people are starting to vote today. So, and the Liberals, the coalition still haven't put out a lot of their policies. So even if something dramatic happened in a week, you probably got almost half of the electorate has already voted. So I don't see a pathway to victory from here. But as Emma said before, always nervous making predictions about election outcomes. I think what we're more at risk of at the moment is a Labor majority. And I think for our democracy and definitely for our climate, we'd be much better off with a Labor minority with strong independent and Greens on the crossbench, forcing, because if I go back to the start of the hour, when Emma pointed out that the last election when Biden came in was off the back of climate activists, people that wanted climate change addressed. And it's the same here. You know, it was a climate election 3 years ago and they haven't fixed it. They haven't delivered. We're opened up more coal. We're still backing gas. Yeah.
Emma, we talked about Trump and drill baby drill, and Dutton hasn't picked up that sort of Trumpism, if you like, for his election campaign. Do you think he's actually gone out of his way to avoid talking about environmental policy and climate policy? That one slip up in the ABC debate was pretty ordinary and cost him a day, I would argue. Do you think he's going out of his way not to talk about it?
It does seem that way. You know, he did seem deeply uncomfortable talking about climate. And I think that is for good reason, you know, that Leanne has highlighted. But I think it's also because, you know, again, the Labor Party has allowed him to do that, to avoid it, because exactly as Leanne said, you know, they haven't acted on a mandate that they had from the last election, and they've been opening up gas fields and being a genuinely, I think, bad faith actor in the climate space, not just domestically, but internationally as well. And so that kind of allows Dutton to avoid the issue or to hedge. I think, you know, where I hesitate to bring it up, but where they have been talking about it, of course, is around nuclear policy and nuclear energy. That's been the kind of circuitous route around to talk about climate policy. But again, you know, that's deeply unpopular when you actually get down to where said nuclear reactors might be. There's deep community opposition to them. And so I think you're absolutely right that they are avoiding talking about climate, but that doesn't mean that there's not an appetite for it in the electorate. You know, it was a climate election last time around. I think Australians do care deeply about this issue. And actually being brave and talking about it, I think has not only kind of obvious benefits in terms of actual climate action, but there are also political benefits to it. And I think that is part of the reason that we may see a minority Labor government, you know, independents who talk about climate action in a genuine way are pretty popular and have been increasingly successful. And so I think Leanne is right that the prospects for a minority government are quite high and could be really really important for not just for climate action, but for a number of issues, not the least of which is Australia's relationship with the United States, where independent candidates are talking about reforming that relationship, about Australia's role in the world and about Australia being a good faith actor and actually stepping up into a leadership role, given the withdrawal of the United States from that space. So I think, a minority government could really shake up not just domestic policy, but foreign policy as well.
Staying on that theme, I have a question from Edwina, talking about the role Australia could play from a climate point of view and what the US is doing. US-led climate research data is under attack from Trump's effort to vaporise or hide the data.
Yep.
But the Public Environment Data Partners, and there's an article today in the Guardian, is frantically trying to save that data to other data sites accessible to all. Can Australia play a role in supporting the efforts to protect that data?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Australia could, I mentioned earlier that there's a real opportunity to support Australian research, Australian tertiary education in particular, and to support the collaborative work that they do with their colleagues in the United States. So I think, Australia stepping up to safeguard some of that information could be a really important action. But I think maybe to zoom out a little bit, there's also a huge opportunity for Australia to play a really positive role in our region and in the Pacific in particular. Australian governments of both varieties have been pretty bad faith actors in the Pacific, where, foreign ministers and prime ministers will go to Pacific nations and talk about, being in our Pacific family or standing shoulder to shoulder and listening to Pacific leaders about what they need and what they care about, which inevitably is climate change, and then turn around and come home and open up another coal mine. That both governments of both sides have done that consistently, and there is a real opportunity, and I think real pressure again from independents and Greens in particular to change that. For Australia to be a genuine partner in the region and to act on climate change in our region. So there are a number of fronts on which they can do that. The United States under the Trump administration has just withdrawn all foreign aid to the Pacific, for example, through its dismantling of USAID. Where is Australia in that? What is the Australian government doing there, and what could it do? And I think being a genuine partner there is critical and is something Australia could absolutely do. We're a rich country. We're actually really good at diplomacy. We're really good at that kind of genuine partnership building when we choose to do it, but we have to choose to do it.
Glenn, can I just ask because I'd love Emma's perspective on this. It's a question from Jackie. And do you think it's conceivable that China, with the support of BRICS and Global South, could start moving more conspicuously into the leadership vacuum that is being left by the US on climate change?
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. And Chinese industry is already a leader in climate action, particularly on solar, and has been consistently for a number of years. I'm always wary of talking about leadership vacuums and the action of great powers, because it tends to see our region in particular as a kind of chessboard where great powers collect little pieces with no regard for what's actually happening to those pieces or the people involved. So I don't think it's as straightforward as China kind of stepping into a vacuum and something that Australia has, needs to be threatened by. I think it's an opportunity. When relations were deteriorating between China and the United States under the Biden administration, the one area that was kind of cordoned off was climate cooperation. That was seen as the pathway back to stabilizing relations between the United States and China. And I think Australia there, again, has an opportunity to collaborate with China rather than to see it as a competitor or a threat, but to actually kind of work together on an issue that doesn't respect national borders or great power demonstrations of great power. And so I think working collaboratively in the region is really critical. And, I think it has to be said that China does provide a huge amount of funding to the Pacific, but is perhaps, I think, more better at recognizing sometimes what those communities are crying out for, and has a history of building infrastructure that's not just security infrastructure, that might be hospitals or things like that. And where Australia and the United States tend to focus entirely on defense infrastructure that doesn't necessarily benefit the countries of the Pacific. And so reframing priorities there away from purely defense issues that see great power competition as kind of the way things are and the inevitable shape of our world, to looking at the things that actually do threaten us, like climate change, and acting there in partnership is a real opportunity.
I suppose if there's anything that can raise us all above concerns around the nation state, it's catastrophic climate change that'll wipe out the planet.
Yeah, you'd hope so.
We are getting close to the end. I might give you both an opportunity to wrap up. If I can come to you, Leanne, with one last question, also from Richard. Will American states, specifically California, still be at COP? Will America still have a presence?
I'm sure that they'll still come and be part of trade, the sideshow. Don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but like that anyone can come and be part of the discussion and trade that happens around the edges of COP, but they won't be given a Guernsey at the negotiating table because they're not a nation state.
Okay. And some closing remarks, if you like, Leanne. I might stay with you. Not all doom and gloom is the theme I get from what I've heard from you over the past hour.
Oh wow, you're more optimistic than I am, Glenn.
Some days.
That's what. Yeah. Look, I think that just on this topic of the US and their impact on the global efforts to do something about climate change, there is some optimism because they have been blockers and they've been masquerading as people who want to actually solve the problem, and that's dangerous. It provides an opportunity for Australia to be a little bit braver and have more leadership. I think that's what people in Australia want. So I think those two things are positive, and I do have optimism for that. The other thing that gladdens my heart is how much Australians aren't embracing Trumpism, because if we were, Albanese, everyone bar possibly the Teals and the Greens would be walking around with a Make Australia Great Again hat on. So the fact that nobody is means that there's been some pretty interesting focus group work done that shows that this is just poison. So I can take optimism from that. I'm glad that we are about to have an election. I hope we do get whatever the parliament is for the next parliament, whatever the makeup is for the next parliament. I really hope that they do. I think there's 5 major things that we have to do for climate and nature over the next parliamentary term. I won't go into all of them, but we will be sending out information on that for anyone on the line who's part of our Coalition for Climate Ambition, and we'll also be putting it up on the Australia Institute website. But just to name one thing that we have to do in the next parliamentary term is release the security paper that was done outlining the security impacts of climate change, which the government has refused to release to the public. That's outrageous. We have a right to know. We need to know it. And there'll be other things, but I might stop there. And one other thing is next week's the last Climate Academy, and Polly will be joining us to tell us everything around climate action, inaction, and the politics for climate and energy in Australia and globally. So I hope to see some of you there. Thanks.
Thanks, Leanne. And also, to pick up on an earlier point, the Canadian election is also next week. It's next Monday.
6 days.
Yeah,
right.
28th of April. Thank you so much for your contributions. Emma, how would you like to wrap up in terms of America's current situation when it comes to dealing with or ignoring climate change?
Look, I think I'd emphasize what Leanne said. This is a huge opportunity for Australia. The Trump administration is so bad. What it is doing in the climate space and across the kind of spectrum of political issues is really deeply dangerous and deeply frightening. What that creates in Australia is that opportunity that Leanne was talking about, because the way Trump has been treating allies like Australia, I think highlights the question of what actually does make us safer. We've always had this idea in Australia that we can rely on the United States to keep us safe. Trump reveals that that is a myth and has always been a myth, and I think can also really help us in Australia to rethink what security means, what actually makes us safer. And what actually makes us safer is action on climate change, not some ridiculous submarine deal that's going to cost Australia $370 billion plus. And we can see, I think, the deep community concern about the relationship and Australia's role in the world and a reconsideration of security. So I think this is a huge opportunity for Australia, and one that comes around, particularly when it comes to Australia's relationship with the United States, so very rarely. And I think we can make the choice to reconsider our role in the world and what makes us safer. As we've discussed, that requires a lot of bravery, but it's absolutely possible. We are a rich country. We have an incredible amount of power and agency, and we can choose to use it.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for your contributions. It's been a great conversation. And thanks to everybody who joined in and made comments and sent questions. As Leanne points out, we're back next week with Polly Hemming and Leanne. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube, where you can catch all of our webinars. You can also subscribe to our podcasts, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and After America with Emma. Thanks for joining us, everyone. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.